There is nowhere to go, and it's me who should know. Won't you please understand? Now I know where to go, where my folks proudly stand. Let me go, let me go to that precious promised land. No more left, no more right. Lift yourself, for there is light. I am proud, can't you see? For at last I am free. Won't you please understand? Now I know where to go, where my folks proudly stand. Let me go to that precious promised land. No more left, no more right. Lift yourself, for there is light. Wir blicken zurück, sie zerstört jede Brücke. Wohin soll ich gehen?
Thank you so much to Chazan. We're going to wait one more minute to start. You know, with Zoom, everything is always, right exactly on time. And we actually have 40 people on already on time.
La 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 la. La 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 la.
Thank you so much to Chazan Shamash, and good evening, everybody. And I'm just going to make a few remarks of welcome, and then we're going to watch the video of Erna Fischer, who David Alpert graciously recorded last week so that everything would be all working. But Erna and her daughter Rita are on with us on Zoom. And so afterwards, we'll have a chance to ask questions. Many of you who know me, know that I love dates, I love history. And so if I think of November in 20th century Jewish history, we have November 9th, 1938, Kristallnacht, in German, the night of broken glass. And many scholars call that the beginning of the Shoah, the beginning of the Holocaust, even though we know that with the coming to power of Hitler in 1933, already the wheels were turning with Nuremberg laws and many different actions against the Jews. And then even after Kristallnacht, September 1st, 1939, the invasion of Poland, and the beginning of the war itself, and then the final solution in 1942. If you can really, obviously, spend a lot of time studying all those things. But that night was the night that all illusions that this was just a little bit of a rise in anti-Semitism in Europe, and that the Jews would be able to withstand this anti-Semitism just as we had done centuries before, that this was really in many ways an end to European Jewry as we know. And some people were fortunate enough to leave as refugees. The definition of a Holocaust refugee is anyone who was uprooted from their home, whether it was before, during, or after the war, and whether they were in a concentration camp or not. And we're going to hear Erna's story of being able to leave without her parents to go to Palestine. So we'll let her share that story. But another date that comes to mind in November is November 29th, 1947, when Erna was already in Palestine. Kaf Tep in November. For those of us who like Long Island history, I'm not sure if the vote took place in Flushing or if in Lake Success. I think it was in Flushing, even though the United Nations headquarters was on Marcus Avenue. Anyway, on that day was when, by a vote of 33, I think to 12, I believe, 33 for sure, voted for the partition plan and the recognition of a Jewish state in Palestine. And so on two Novembers, really just 9 years apart, we go from the depths to the rising. And so on Kristallnacht, we remember going down to the depths, but as we're going to hear in Erna's story, going up to the rising. And also makes me think of another fellow Viennese person, Viennan, I guess, Theodor Herzl, who in the 1890s also thought that he was welcomed into European Jewry and went to college in France, tried to join a fraternity and was rejected, and then ended up being a journalist covering the Albert Dreyfus affair when he was falsely accused of treason, even though it was a non-Jew who committed it. And even though it was proven, they still continued to scapegoat Dreyfus. And so we're going to hear Erna's story shared by David, and then people can ask questions as we commemorate and recognize that we need to continue to hear these stories as much as we can to keep the memory alive. And so, David, whenever you're ready to share the video.
Yeah, I just want to introduce the video, but I wanted to say on behalf of Temple Israel and the Shoah Remembrance Committee and my co-chair, Robert Panza, that I take this opportunity to thank Erna Fisher for sharing her experiences and story. I have edited the conversations we had 2 weeks ago at the home of her daughter, Rita Hall, here in Great Neck. Erna's story brings to light an episode in the history of the Shoah that is important for us to hear. Erna's memory is crystal clear. It was a privilege to hear her tell her story and experiences. And as we lose our survivors and the direct connection to the Shoah, we must cherish the ability to hear firsthand from our survivors to ensure that their experiences are not forgotten. Thank you, Erna, for relating your experiences, and Rita for facilitating and ensuring that your mom's story was told. I will now play the recording. We look forward to conversing with Erna and Rita following the presentation. And Rabbi, for making full screen again, what was the button I hit?
For you in the Apple, I believe it was the green circle up top left.
Up top left. I don't see that green circle, but we'll try. Okay, share. And I'm not full screen right now, right?
No, but you see the green circle on the top left? You just had it for a second ago. There you go.
Oh, yeah. Yes, very good, Rabbi. Okay, I got it. Very good.
Just knew about it and felt it, but personally, I felt it when I was about 8 years old in school, a girl called me a dirty Jew. And I did not like that. I requested to go to the principal, who was a woman. In fact, her husband was a very well-known judge. That didn't seem to affect her in any way. Well, when I complained about that girl, who I thought should have had to be sent to the principal also, but wasn't. She said, well, little girl, you'll have to get used to that. And I promptly answered, I won't have to, and I won't. Well, didn't like that answer. She said, you have a big mouth. I want to see your mother tomorrow. First thing in the morning, my mother came to school. And when she faced the principal, she said exactly what I had said. I didn't think that you should have to tell a child to get used to that you should have called that other child down and chastised her. Rather, didn't happen. So this was my really first personal taste. And not only was it that, this was when I was about 8 years old. I'm going on 103. One of the things which never left my memory was such an impression, left such an impression, bad of course. But, you know, anti-Semitism was around. It was like the air. We knew that. My friends in schools were always only Jewish. And it was a mixed population, of course, in that school. In fact, there were many more Catholic.
Tell me about your family and Jewish tradition, religion. You know, for you in Vienna, were you guys, do you regard yourselves as Orthodox?
No.
Obviously, no.
We were really, my parents belonged to a synagogue. You know, I don't even know that at that time in Vienna there were different Orthodox or conservative. I don't know. I would judge it as being a conservative synagogue. I don't know if there were such distinctions. I do not know. It was the synagogue we belonged to was fairly new. A few people gave money. My father was among them to build the building, which, by the way, survived the war. And my parents were not religious. I did go to a youth congregation once a week in the afternoon, just to be kept up a little bit. But I did have a bat mitzvah. I did have that, which was together with a few other kids the same age. We had that, and of course my parents. I mean, we had a seder, but they were not religious in that way. They were more traditional Jews, which in a way was surprising because my mother's father, whom I had never known, he died when she was a teenager. He was a rabbi, a very religious Orthodox rabbi. So for me to be growing up in a non-Orthodox household was really peculiar. But my mother did not go in that direction. So. And all my friends were about the same. You know, their parents went to synagogue on the holidays. Some of them didn't even do that. But we knew they were Jewish, and the people my parents associated, except for people whom my father had to see on a business way, they were all Jewish. In the area where we live, part of the city of it, there were quite a few Jewish families. Not a lot, but quite a few. And it was all upper middle class. It was more a group of intelligent people, politically aware people, but religion was not their main. I didn't come from a religious household, but from a, what should I say, traditional Jewish household.
So was your family involved in any of the Zionist movements?
My family wasn't really, but they allowed me to be. And my father was very, should I say, he was hoping for a Jewish state, but he was, don't forget, at that time, when I joined the party, my parents were already close to 60 or maybe 60. There was this, my parents were in their 40s when they had me, don't forget. So, yes, they allowed me and they were very sympathetic to the fact that I joined the Zionist youth organization. They liked that because they knew I would be together with the same kind of kids. That was it, but they were not active Zionists, no.
And talk a little bit about you were studying to be a teacher and you were going to be a translator, and what happened then, and also the man you were engaged to, both those stories.
Well, first of all, of course, I expected to go to we called a university, which didn't happen because Hitler came. But what I managed to do for one school year is to still go to a special language school, because I had intended to be a translator of French literature into German. So I wanted that skill, at least wanted that. That was that. On the other hand, I met a man who was quite a bit older than me, which is not unusual when I was a teenager, right? And in fact, he played the piano where I took dancing lessons. In those days, everything was on a personal basis. You had a piano, you had a guy who played it. You could adjust the tempo of his playing to the way we were doing whatever we were doing. And somehow we took it off. It became a very, very innocent relationship, but we got engaged. In fact, we had already been negotiating for an apartment not far from where my parents were. But then, of course, Hitler came and he was going to what then was Czechoslovakia, where he got a very good deal with Philip Jan. He had studied law. He was a lawyer. As a Jewish guy with a very Jewish sounding name, couldn't find a job. Could not find a job in the end. So he relied on what had been his hobby, music. He got a very good gig in Czechoslovakia. Well, I didn't want to go to Czechoslovakia. I emigrated because I knew I couldn't stay in Austria. I wouldn't be able to go to university or any school, I couldn't pursue sports. Nothing. You couldn't go to a swimming pool or to anything. Not only that, you were really persecuted. In fact, my father was one of many brothers and sisters, but none of them lived in Germany. They lived mostly, some of them still in Poland, some in Germany, but nobody in Austria. But they met particularly in Czechoslovakia, in those spas they met. And my father said, this is going to come to Austria. And he'd been well, he would have left right then and there. It's just because, Parkinson's makes you also infirm. So his brother always, you were a pessimist from way back. He says, no, I'm a realist. I can see. He saw it. Unfortunately, he couldn't do anything about it. They themselves were not young anymore, didn't speak a foreign language. And my father was not well. And otherwise, he would have probably whatever money they could smuggle out, the takeout, and done whatever. But it was just a physical impediment which kept him. when the day Hitler came to Vienna, it so happened I was in the center of town in that school where I was studying French and French literature. On my way home, they grabbed me physically and took me to the Central Synagogue in Vienna and made me scrub the floor. You know that? And even then, I thought, isn't that peculiar? Why would they be interested that the floor in the synagogue should be clean? That doesn't make sense to me. But they kept me there for quite a few hours. My parents were frantic. I didn't come home. Oh, but eventually they said, okay, enough, you can go now, after a few hours. It was very nice. I mean, I wasn't the only one. They grabbed a few young women off the street. I wasn't the only one. And we cleaned that synagogue, very nice. Now you can go. I have no idea what the purpose was other than, doing something bad to us. That's it. That was my only really physical encounter. Of course, when I applied, when you were going to leave, you needed an exit. Not only did you need an entry visa to the country you were going to, but you needed an exit visa. No, for instance, even I had never worked or never made money. I had to prove that I don't owe money, that I did all kinds of stupid things, that I don't have a police record. But I had to apply for in person for the exit visa. I stood there in that office in the front, huge queue for hours. They cut it off just with maybe 2 or 3 people before me, no more. I had to come back the next day. So it was all very complicated and very nerve-wracking. Particularly for a person, I was this innocent youngster. All of a sudden I was thrown into politics, and the only thing which my father could do for me was buy the ticket for the boat, which would take me from Trieste, which was to Palestine.
When did you leave in 1938?
I left in August.
In August.
I think.
So at that time, the Anschluss was in March.
Of
Right.
course.
And what was the impact of that on your family when that happened?
Well, on my parents at first, not so terribly, but after I had left already, somebody who was a competitor in my father's business and who had been a Nazi from way back, as it turned out, was able to take over the business. Until the war broke out, we could still communicate. But then, of course, we couldn't, because we were enemy countries, so to speak. So what we did, it so happened, I knew that my father had a friend who had gone to Switzerland because that friend's son lived in Switzerland. So what I did do was I would write a letter to my parents, send it to him. He would change the envelope and send it on to my parents. It was not it didn't happen like every other day, but that was the way I kept in touch with them. Until my mom, of course, that was much later, my parents had to leave their apartment. In fact, they were moved 3 times. First, they had to share the apartment. First, there's another little apartment, a totally different area. Then they were forced to share another apartment with other people. And after my father passed away, my mother was still transferred to a smaller place, some of which I knew at the time, some of which I only found out way after the war, when I could find out what even happened to my parents there.
And do you know at what point your mother went to Theresienstadt and at what point she went to Auschwitz? Did you know all that?
I didn't know it then. I didn't even know it. I knew nothing. Only after the war, of course, after the war, I realized that she had been to Auschwitz. But then Austria and Germany, they kept very good records. So by applying it to the Red Cross and then to the Austrian police, I got the whole, which didn't help me much, but I got the dates exactly when she was transferred to Theresienstadt, when she was transferred from Theresienstadt to Auschwitz, which unfortunately was very close to the end of the war.
So when you were in Israel, at what point did you know that your mother, where your mother had been moved, or in fact that she didn't survive? Like at what point did all of that happen?
After the war, I can't. My mother knew where I was. I hadn't known where she was. So I figured that if she survived, she would know where to come, or at least where to send me a note. And I didn't hear, and nobody came. It was pretty obvious to me that she was no longer alive. I didn't know at the time right away what really happened. But, you know, at the time there were so many people, Jews who had died. You knew. My mother wasn't young. I mean, she was in her 60s already at the time. Had she survived, the first thing would have been to send me a note, right? If I didn't hear from her, it was pretty obvious. She was in Theresienstadt for maybe a year or more. And then, fortunately, in Auschwitz, I assume, for that I don't have a real date, but I assume that she was killed because of her age, that she was killed right after she got there. This is my only, what can I say, not even consolation, but because much later I went to Auschwitz and I saw all those people living, or whatever you want to call it. And as I said, it's my fervent wish that, but I hope that she was killed right away, rather than there. So, but all of these things, at first we only assumed. First of all, the horrors of Auschwitz and all this, we didn't know that. It wasn't that obvious whether you were in America or you were anywhere else. Although there were people from Germany who had told American politicians what was happening, but they did not seem to pay too much attention to that. So we didn't really know exactly what happened. All these things about the death camps and all that became known after the war. So that time I was a young married woman. First one child and then child number 2 came. Have to leave, it has to be Palestine, simply because I knew that my parents, it's the only place where they could follow me. My father had Parkinson's. No country would let you in with a disease. But Palestine was a mandate. It wasn't a country really, it was a mandate. They had other qualifications, but illness was not one of the things which prevented you from coming there. And I could go there because I was just the right age to become a student at the university, Hebrew University in Jerusalem, which at that time, just the university existed, and in Haifa, the Technion, that was it. All the other institutions of higher learning came much later. So I left by myself, no money, certainly didn't speak the language, nor did I speak English. My chosen language had been French. So I left alone, without money, without knowing anybody, except and he went immediately to a place where I could apply for my parents. There was an office in Jerusalem. I applied for them immediately. My parents had previously smuggled money out of Vienna because There were three categories at that time who could come into Palestine. One was a student, one was a specialist for something which they still needed. That's why a lot of doctors were allowed to come. And the third one was what they called a capitalist. Capitalist was 1,000 English pounds. Wasn't all that much money. Just was costing my parents a lot of money because they smuggled it out. So it wasn't a legal transfer. It was told. I immediately established a trust account in their name. And on the basis of that, this was all within a few days. With the help of this gentleman who was my cousin's friend, I applied immediately for my parents. And if the war had not taken place when it did, a week later, they would have been able to come out.
When you got to Palestine, what was your life like when you first got there? How did you live? How did you take care of yourself?
My cousin had found a room for me with the family. In other words, I don't know what you call this in English, but I had a room with a family who had a daughter my age. Now those people were kosher. I knew nothing about kashrut. And I saw there was a double sink. I thought one was for washing the vegetables. No, one was for meat, one was for... And they allowed me to put things in the fridge. I didn't dare to do anything. Since I was so unfamiliar with the kashrut business, I didn't want to do anything or touch anything. I was very young, and for me to live with other family was very strange. Anyway, my jobs were I just could pay my rent, which was £2 a month. And funny enough, the Austrians allowed to transfer money to me as a student, very little, I can't remember, but it covered my rent and just less than basics, you know. But I had that cousin who was a kosher butcher and who brought home cold cuts. Of course, he gave me. So this between, I also had a card from the university. I could go to their Mensa, which was in town. University was out of town, but the Mensa, the restaurant, whatever you call it, was in town. For next to nothing, I could get a soup, bread was free, and the pudding. Every day, I went for the soup, the bread, and pudding. And then in the evening, very often, I had the cold cuts, which my cousin had brought for me. I didn't live with him or anything, but he brought me cold cuts. So I didn't have to starve. Then my next job was in a coffee shop, just for the breakfast. So I had to give the people the breakfast, but I also had to wash the dishes, and it was not a very easy job. That was in the morning. Hardly ever rent. Food was covered, and the rent was covered by whatever my parents were. This was until the war broke out, of course. So I lived really on this. I always said, and I had brought a very nice wardrobe. My father insisted that when you leave the country, you have to be well dressed. He took me to some, anyway, he insisted that so I always said I'm the best dressed beggar in the whole country. But when you are 19, that is not, you don't worry about that, really. I mean, as long as you have a room, you were existing. And I got together with because I ate in the student cafeteria, I got to meet other students. So you had company, had enough to eat. That's all.
Great.
It was a very big come down from a very comfortable childhood. And all of a sudden,
Different
it
life.
came and it died.
A different life.
And it died.
So when did you start the process in Israel of applying for a visa to the United States?
It turned out that my cousin, who by that time had become my husband, had wanted to go to the United States from way back. And now there was at that time a quota system. I don't know if it still exists. And it went not by the country, whether you were a citizen of, but this place where you were born. Now he was born in Poland, brought to Germany as a very small child, never spoke a word of Polish or knew it. But even though I had a German passport, was a Polish, so he was on the Polish quota, which was horrible. When he married me, and I always thought that's why he married me, it wasn't true. Came on the Austrian quota, which was good. And then I didn't want to leave.
So you were happy with your life in Israel?
Oh, it was a life on more or less on the shoestrings. We were never wealthy. I was happy because it was Israel. It was, that's what I dreamt of. And all of a sudden it's not an easy life. There were a lot of confrontations with the Arabs. We were always in danger of being hurt or killed. So we were taken around. At one time we had an afternoon tea with the president of the country. Very nice, and there were speeches and all kinds of stuff. And in the end, he walked around to everybody. Thank you for coming. Did you enjoy the trip? Yeah, what did you find? And I said, I found Austria as anti-Semitic as I have left.
That's too bad.
No, kind of.
You said this to the president?
In German, particularly in Austria, we have of course, they have a thing for a woman, they say, very honorable lady. In German, it's gnädige Frau. It's so convoluted, it's ridiculous. They kiss your hand, very honorable lady. So in the end, when we came back to the hotel, but how did you dare say that? So what are they going to do me now? What? There's nothing more.
Good for you.
They did to me everything they could have done.
Thank you. I'm going to stop share, Rabbi.
Okay. And we're going to recognize Rabbi Stecker, who is going to sum things up, and then we're going to allow room for questions.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Schreber. I'm honored to be here, and it's really so reassuring and inspiring. We have over 70 people who have come, Erna, to hear your story. And first of all, before I thank you, Erna, I want to thank David Albert for convening this interview and for the editing of David and Rob presiding over the Shoah Committee and the entire Shoah Committee. And Erna, just to thank you for sharing your extraordinary story in an extraordinary way with humor and such vivid detail. And it's really, if we all stop and think about it, it's just so emotional to think about you in 2021 recalling so vividly your experiences as a young girl being made to clean the floor of the synagogue and experiencing the rise of Hitler and the Anschluss and everything that meant for you, and then how you navigated all of that. In American Jewish literature, there's an author, Delmore Schwartz, who wrote a story called In Dreams Begin Responsibilities. And I want to just riff on that a little bit. In stories begin responsibilities. You have shared a story with us, which is part of the story of the Jewish people and part of the story of humanity. And in your story lie our responsibilities to not only support you, but to convey your story and others that are in some ways similar and in other ways different, so that our people and humanity understand that this was not something that was made up, but that this was something that our people experienced and that needs to be reckoned with. So thank you for your courage. Thank you for your candor. Thank you for your incredibly articulate. I'm also imagining, so if you are more fluent in German and in French and possibly you know Hebrew and now you're speaking English, and it's just so impressive. All of us, I'm looking around the screens and everybody is just so impressed and inspired by you. So Yishar Koach, thank you for having the strength to share what you shared with us in the way that you shared. Rabbi Schweber, I know, is going to convene questions that people have. So if people have questions, you can raise your hand virtually if you like. If you actually raise your hand, we'll try to find your hand.
If you go
If you
to
have a
like,
question,
there's a
chat. Yeah, Rabbi
raise
Schweber,
hand function. If it says, I think it's reactions, I think is where you can see the raise hand. Yes. If you click on the reactions where there's a little smiley face and a plus, then you'll see a raise hand function and we can raise your hand to ask the question. Why don't, David, I know I'm going to spotlight you too, David, as well. And why don't you ask your couple questions while people think about what questions they might have to have. You can also chat me if you don't want to raise your hand. You can chat the question if you'd like. So David, please.
Yeah. So Rita, thank you so much. I have a question. The recording with Rita and Erna went on for an hour and a half, and so this was about 28 minutes of that. I didn't get an opportunity, Erna, to talk about your dad's business and what your dad did in Austria, and how the business was taken away. Could you give us some information about that?
He had a wholesale paper business. Sorry. In Austria at that time, a factory could never sell anything in retail to a customer. Everything had to go through a wholesaler. And my father, who had worked for a company like that, but that company didn't exist anymore when he came back from the war, having served 4 years. So he opened on a shoestring his own business. And he had that business for only 20 years, was enormously successful, and made a great go of it. So in other words, he got the paper wholesale from the factory and sold it. Amongst other things, one of the biggest newspapers in Vienna was printed on the paper which he provided. And of course, lots of books and lots of stuff. He did very well. And then a competitor who always was envious of this Jew having been so successful took over. It was not hard to do that. He said, this business needs a supervisor. So he came in as a so-called supervisor and eventually took over. Took it away, just took it away. That was not unusual in those times at that place. It was very common. Go ahead.
Toby, can I spotlight you for your question? You have to unmute yourself, please. You need to unmute, Toby.
David, first of all, thank you so much. And David, the minor thing, the technical aspects of this were incredible. Thank you very much. And the other point that I want to make is you can read about these things, and some people say, oh, I read a book, it's okay. There is no way to understand what happened until you hear it from the mouth of somebody who lived through it. And this is the only way we can really attempt to understand what really happened. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to switch to Lori Benheimer.
Okay, hi. Thank you so much, Erna and Rita, for making this possible. Erna, did you finish university? And if you did, where did you do that? And did you utilize your, your studies to, work in whatever field?
It's a glow for all of the above. University was in my plan when I was finishing high school in Vienna. Of course, not only by leaving could I not go. I could never have gone. I would never have been accepted as a Jewish student at the Viennese college or university. But when I came to Palestine, I had to make a living. I had the lousiest jobs anybody could ever imagine. In other words, from one stupid job to the other, just to survive. And eventually I was lucky enough to get married and have children. Higher education, unfortunately, had escaped me for my whole life. So it was not to be.
Thank you.
I'll give her an honorary degree.
That I accept with pleasure. And I know I deserve it.
I just have to say that my mother is so educated, cultured, and fantastic at languages. I mean, you can't even. I can't even begin. My son is the same. I'm medium, but it's kind of skipped a generation, and she's so cultured and knowledgeable and self-taught in every way. So would have been nice to go to university, but she's okay.
There's something about life experience that certainly really enlightened you. Oh, for Panzer has a question. You can unmute yourself if you'd like.
Hi, I was wondering, at what point were you comfortable sharing your story with your children?
Well, my children never asked, and I really never shared the story with them. But they found out it's only when I talked to other people. They really never asked.
That's not true.
There's Rita, by the way.
As I grew up, I knew the story of you and Dad. I knew the stories.
Well,
I didn't know some things, but mostly I did. No, that's
okay.
not true. No, you actually did know most of it.
Yeah, of course, whatever happened once we were a family, but the details in between, I'm not sure.
Yeah, of course, you're appropriate in holding back some things because I don't know what age, but you're her daughter, Rita. At what age do you remember? Like, were you elementary school, high school? I'm just curious, at what point do you?
I think I was always aware of pieces of the story as they came up, because I lived in a neighborhood in Queens and Forest Hills, where my mother still lives, where all of my friends were similarly, had parents who had fled Europe and managed to survive. So I was in a very comfortable environment of people just like me, for whom, concentration camps and no grandparents and a bilingual household were the norm. That was what I was used to. So nothing was held back. If we would ask questions, we got the answers. I pretty much, I didn't know everything, but I knew a lot, All did.
Okay, thank you. This is very meaningful.
Any other questions?
This Rabbi Stecker again. So Erna, just when you got to the United States, how did you discover over time more members of your family that had survived the Shoah?
No.
Okay.
First of all, my immediate family was just my parents and I.
Right.
My mother had siblings who were much older than she. She was her mother was the second wife of a rabbi who had lost his first wife through death. And there were children from that first marriage who were much, much older than my mother. So on my mother's side, I only knew one brother who was a little younger than she, who survived and with whom I was very close. He married very late in life. So he was a bachelor who loved the niece. And we We were very close, and he came to the house and all that. And he died before Hitler ever came. So on my mother's side, there was nobody. On my father's side, there were lots of brothers and sisters. He was one of 12. Most of them had lived in Poland. I didn't even know all of them. I knew quite a few of them, those who would come to Vienna to visit. But only later did we find out, but not one survived by having come to Israel. Very few survived. One had survived because he had gone to Italy to a maritime school, become a ship engineer. But another one had come to Palestine also after the war. Most of them were killed during the war. One survived in Australia and had never known her. I only knew of her. So in other words, of that very large family, there were very few survivors. Much later, in fact, only recently, have some people come up, and we are for a very extended family, but nobody whom I had known or known of when I was young, when I was at home. I only knew the few who came fairly regularly to Vienna. There were two sisters of my father's whom I knew. Both, one sister survived and came to us, to Israel. The other one was killed in her house with her husband together in front of her daughter who survived.
In Warsaw by the Nazis.
Yeah, in Poland. In other words, my father's sister and her husband were killed in front of their daughter. The daughter survived. Much later, I met her in London. She made her way to London. I met her almost hardly anybody's. There was another cousin who was killed in a concentration camp. The biggest part of the family were exterminated.
David.
Erna, you described, and this is something that touched me a bit, and I'm sorry I didn't add that to the presentation, that after the war, you went to Vienna, and your father was buried in the cemetery in Vienna, but that you wanted to add your mother's name to the tombstone.
I wanted to, and I did.
And you did. And it described the reasons for that and why that was important to you.
Well, the reason for it was that I never knew a real date of her death, nor did I mean, there was no grave, there was nothing. So the only thing I could do was put her on my father's tombstone. Funny enough, not funny, but at that time, hardly anybody did that. In fact, people questioned me, and I wrote killed in Auschwitz. I said, so, my mother's birth date, I didn't know her date of death, killed in Auschwitz. And some people said, how did I dare do that? I didn't see any daring. I didn't see anything terrible. This was done later by many people who had graves in Vienna and most likely in other cities too. It became a thing where they commemorated without the person really being buried there, just commemorated the name. And that's what I did.
We have time for one or two more questions if anybody has one. If not, I'm going to really just say really thank you from the bottom of all of our hearts for sharing the story. It has been recorded for posterity, and I think also we'll probably show it to our teens and to our students, because as we always say, the Dor from generation to generation, to make sure that this story continues. And thank you to all for your questions. And actually the question that Ofer sort of brought up and asking Rita just about growing up in the story, the one thing that, Rita can reflect on another time is she didn't have grandparents growing up. And so that was often the case for many of the children of survivors and of refugees, was that if the grandparents didn't make it and survive, then they grew up without grandparents. And so really it's important that we continue to tell the story and to use Kristallnacht and Yom HaShoah and other experiences. And that's where we really think that we have the Shoah Remembrance Committee, whose mission is really to keep the memories alive, to keep the studying alive, so that we can make sure that this never happens again to anyone, Jews, and to anyone in this world. I'm going to invite Chazan Shamash to chant the Amali Rachamim, the memorial prayer. Yeah, we often say this, obviously, on Yom HaShoah, but I believe that this evening, or in the week of Kristallnacht, to also remember. And so I invite you, as you're able, to rise. And if you'd like to follow along, if you have the blue Siddur, because we're going to be doing the evening service afterwards, it is on page 196. Page 196, please rise.
Malei Rachamim, Shochen Bamromim, Hametzeh Menucha Nechona תחת כנפי השכינה, במעלות קדושים וטהורים, כזוהר הרקיע מזהירים, לנשמות כל אחינו בית ישראל, אנשים, נשים וטף, שנצבחו ושנחנקו ושנשרפו ושנהרגו על קידוש השם בימי השואה, בגן עדן תהא מנוחתם. הענם בעל הרחמים, הסירם בשאת כנפיך לעולמים, ותרון בצרה חיים את נשמותיהם, אדוני הוא נחלתם. וינוחו בשלום, בשלום, בשלום המשכבותיהם, ונאמר Amen.
Exalted, compassionate God, grant infinite rest in your sheltering presence among the holy and pure. To the souls of the children of Israel who perished in the Shoah, men, women, and children, who were slaughtered and suffocated and burned to ashes, may the memory endure, inspire deeds of charity and goodness in our lives. May their souls thus be bound up in the bond of life. May they all rest in peace. And let us all say, Amen.
Amen.
Thank you all for joining us for the Kristallnacht portion of the evening. We're going to transition in just a moment to the evening service, which the Chazan will lead us. If you have a Siddur, it's going to be on page 200, actually page 1 for Ashrei first. Page 1 for Ashrei.
אשרי יושבי ביתך, הודי הללוך סלע. תהילה בפי, ויברך כל בשר, שם קודשו לעולם ועד, ואנחנו נברכיה, מעתה ועד עולם, הללויה.
Warner's Kaddish, page 12. Yitzkadal, v'yikadash shemei rabah, v'yama dibra kibutei, v'yamich makutei, v'chayechon v'yomechon, v'chayei dechol beit Yisrael, v'agala uvizman hari v'imru amen. Yehei shmei rabah barach le'olam amen amaya. Yifarach v'yishtabach v'yifa'ar v'yitamam v'yinaser, Yitzhadar v'yitalef v'yitalal, Mei l'kedusha v'yichol. Le'ela v'yichol b'chata v'shirata, Tush b'chata v'nechamata, Miran v'yama v'imru amen. Yehei shlama rabba mishamayim, Chayim aleinu v'yakol Yisrael v'imru amen. Oseh shalom v'rama, Koya aseh aleinu v'yakol Yisrael v'imru amen.
Amen.
Continue on page 281.
And before we begin the evening service, we have one of our students who has graciously volunteered to lead the Shema and the V'ahavta. So Olivia, if you'll, we're going to add a spotlight, and if you'll turn on your camera, if you're there, I see you, we'll add you to the spotlight, so this way you'll be ready to help to lead. Thank you so much. So just add a spotlight, and you can feel free to unmute so you're ready to. והוא רחום מכפר עוון ולא ישחית, והרבה להשיב אפו, ולא יאיר כל חמתו. אדוני הושיע המלך יעננו, ויום קוראנו. ברכו את אדוני המבורך.
Baruch המבורך לעולם ועד.
ברוך אדוני המבורך לעולם ועד. ברוך אתה אדוני אלוהינו מלך העולם אשר בדברו בדברו. הוא מעביר יום מביא לילה, הוא מבדיע בין יום ובין לילה, אדוני צבאות שמו, חי וקיים תמיד ימלוך עלינו לעולם ועד. ברוך אתה אדוני המעריב הרביב, אהבת עולם בית ישראל עמך אהבת. כי הם חיינו ואורך ימינו, והם נגע יומם ולילה, ואהבתך תשים ממנו לעולמים. ברוך אתה אדוני, אוהב עמו ישראל.
שמע ישראל, אדוני אלוהינו, אדוני אחד.
ברוך שם כבוד מלכותו לעולם ועד.
ואהבת את אדוני אלוהיך בכל לבך ובכל נפשך ובכל מאודיך, והיו הדברים האלו Asher Anahim
Avecha
Necha
Hayom Alevavecha
Veshinantam Levanecha
Levanecha
V'divarta Bam V'shivtecha V'metecha V'votecha Derech
Uvishochtecha
Ukumecha Ukshartam Leot Al Yadecha Dehayu V'tatafet Beinenecha Utaftam Almazizah Beitacha Uvisharecha.
Yam Shemot Tishmo Sai Asher Anochim Etevedechem. Adonai Elohechem Emet. V'men HaKotzot V'kayam Aleinu Ki Hu Adonai Eloheinu Ben Sodom Yisrael. ומלכותו ברצון קיבלו עליהם משה ומרים ובני ישראל לכנו שירה בשמחה רבה ואמרו כולם מי כמוך באלים אדוני מי כמוך נדע בקודש נורא תהילות אוסף אלה מלכותך ראו וענך בוקע ים לפני משה זה אלי אנו ואמרו אדוני ימלוך לעולם ועד ונאמר כי פד אדוני את יעקב וגלו מיד חזק ממנו ברוך אתה אדוני גאל ישראל.
Amen. Hashkivi.
אדוני אלינו לשלום ועמידנו מלכנו לחיים.
Spread over us your shelter of peace. Guide us with your good counsel. Save us because of your mercy, and shield us from enemies and pestilence, from starvation, sword, and sorrow.
כי יש שומרנו מצילנו אתה, כי יש מלכנו ורחום אתה, ושמור צאתנו ובואנו לחיים ושלום מעתה ועד עולם. ברוך אתה אדוני, שומר עמו ישראל לעד.
Please rise.
יתקרב ויתקדש שמי רבה,
Amen.
ורמד דברי חירותי וימליך מלכותי, בחייכון ובמכון ובחיי לכל בית ישראל, בגלה ובזמן קריב אמרו אמן. שמי רבה מלך לעלם עלמיה, יפרח וישתבח ויתפאר ויתרום ויתנשא, ויתהדר ויתעלה ויתעלה, שמי קודשיו בריחו. לילה מנחה בחטא ושירתה, תשפטה ונחמתה דמירן בעמה, ואמרו אמן.
Take a few moments for private prayer, 286 to 291 in the prayer book, as well as our own private meditation.
עושה שלום במרומיו, הוא יעשה שלום עלינו ועל כל ישראל, ואמרו אמן. עושה שלום במרומיו, הוא יעשה שלום עלינו ועל כל ישראל, ואמרו אמן.
Continue on 294.
יתקרא ויתקרא שמי רבה, ילמד דברי חירותי ומניח מלכותי בחיי חון ומכון, ובחיי ריחו בית ישראל, בגלה ובזמן קריב, אמרו אמן. יהי שמי רבה מברך, לעלם ועלמי עלמיה. יתברך וישתבח ויתפאר ויתרום ויתנשא, ויתהדר ויתעלה ויתעלה, שמי תקודשה בריחו. לילה מן כל ברכתה ושירתה, תשבחתה ונחמתה, תמירן בעלמה, ואמרו אמן. תתקבל צלות רבתון דרכו ישראל, קודם עוון וישמעיה, ואמרו אמן. יהי שלום רבים שמעיה וחיים עלינו ועל כל ישראל, ואמרו אמן. עושה שלום במרומיו, הוא יעשה שלום עלינו ועל כל ישראל, ואמרו amen.
297.
And Olivia, you can lead us in the Aleinu. Oh, you should unmute though.
Sorry, I don't know why it keeps doing that.
I just make sure you're not resting on the space bar. Aleinu l'shabach.
Aleinu l'shabach la'adon ha'kol, la'atit gedula li'otzer breshit, shelo asanu k'goyei ha'aratzon, velo samanu k'mishpachot ha'adama, shelo sam hokinu kahem, v'goralinu k'chol hamonam, anachnu korim.
ומשתחווים מונים.
לפני מלך מלכי המלכים, הקדוש ברוך הוא.
שהוא נוטה שמיים ויוצר הארץ ומשבח. כי המלכות שלך היא עולה מעט תמלוך בכבוד, ככתוב בתורתך, אדוני ימלוך לעולם ועד.
ונאמן והיה אדוני ומלך על כל הארץ, ביום ההוא יהיה אדוני אחד, ושמו echad.
Mourner's Kaddish, page 298. Yitzgadal v'kadash b'nei rabba v'yama divrat yuteh v'yamishmachuteh v'chayechon v'yomechon v'chayei kol beit Yisrael B'agala ubizman kariv b'imru amen. Yehi shmei Rambam Barach le'olam v'chaya. Yiparach v'yishtabach v'amar v'tamam v'yisem v'chadar v'tabeh v'talal shemei kedusha v'yichud. Le'elam v'kol v'chata v'shivata v'shivachata v'nechumata v'miran v'yama v'imru amen. Yehi shlam harav amin v'chaim avinu v'yavo Yisrael v'imru amen. Oseh shalom avinu v'yavo Yisrael v'imru amen.
Amen.
Yeshua Chazak Baruch to Chazan Shamash and to Olivia Yachbes for leading us this evening in the Mariv. Tomorrow morning, Minyan is at 7:30 a.m. and tomorrow evening at 8 o'clock. Have a good night, everybody.
Good night.
I will be at the synagogue